Welcome back. So we're looking at the first couple of chapters of this collection of lectures called the Psychoses. We've talked a little bit about, broadly speaking, child development, entrance into language, and the like. One of the things that I said last time was that however a child enters into language, however they become socialized, the first word they learn is no. And that doesn't mean that literally the first word they learn is no. It means that when we start asking children to speak their mother tongue, which is to say the mother's tongue or the father's tongue or the primary caregiver's tongue, in other words, when we ask them to start speaking like us and using language, we always do so with a sense of prohibition. Learning to speak a language is also coming to accept that you are prohibited from returning to a state where you don't speak a language. That's really important here. The entrance into language comes with it a kind of acceptance of the prohibition against not entering into language. It's kind of complicated to think, but when you really put your mind to it, it makes a lot of sense. What you are barred from, prohibited from, when you start learning a language is ever returning to a state that is pre-linguistic, a state of existence before language. Once you're asked to learn a language, once you start learning a language, you can't go back. You can't pretend like that didn't happen. In other words, to accept a language beyond your cries, a language that is not your own but one that you're asked to speak, you have to accept also a kind of prohibition against pre-linguistic, non-word using cries and the like. This prohibition, last time I referred to as castration. I don't like this choice of word, but it is the word that Lacan is using. It doesn't mean literal. It's not a physical process of castration. It's not like that. Castration for him is a symbolic practice. It's what happens when you are prohibited from doing it your way. So the example that we talked about last time was like a kid at the store. The primary caregiver, when the kid starts crying, blah, 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 the primary caregiver says, I don't understand you when you cry like that. Use your words. Use your words. I can't understand you. I can't give you what you want if you don't use your words. And over time, the child learns to use their words instead of their cries. That's a kind of castration because it says you need to start talking like me if you're going to gain any recognition, if you're going to have your demands met, your desires met. That process is known as castration. It's known as prohibition. It's also the same thing that happens when you enter into language, just like when you enter into society. When you learn that there's something out there beyond you and your own individual needs and demands, you can't pretend like that didn't happen. You can't go back to pretending like that world doesn't exist. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. If we pursue this myth, we might have something like this. They're in the Garden of Eden, and they don't know that there's anything outside of that. Once they get kicked out, though, they know now that there's a difference between what's happening in the Garden of Eden and what's happening outside the Garden of Eden. Even if they were allowed to go back to the Garden of Eden, they would never forget that there's something on the outside, something other than the Garden of Eden. In other words, they cannot return to this Edenic state before they were kicked out. They can't go back to that state and pretend like they don't know there's something else out there, an outside, a beyond Eden. That's partly why they can never go back. It's not that they can't go back and visit the Garden of Eden, it's that they can't go back and have an Edenic life, a life lived as though there's nothing outside of Eden. This is a review of that no, that prohibition. Once you enter language, once you start speaking language, you can't go back. You can visit, at the level of a cry, at the level of a scream, at the level of a regressive whimper, or the like. But once you have entered the field of language, you're now split between your linguistic, civilized, socialized self and that original, biological, animalistic, pre-linguistic self that cried when it didn't get what it needed or wanted. Now you have words, and more importantly, you have a choice. As little kids know all too well, they have a choice. They can cry about it and not get what they want, or they can use the primary caregiver's language and maybe get what they want. That split subjectivity is an important part of what it means to be normal. In the case of psychoanalysis, neurotic. The neurotic subject is one that is split constantly between embodied physical urges and disembodied linguistic, abstract, symbolic constraints. That split subjectivity is central to normal child development. In the case of the psychotic, something goes wrong, and that's what we'll talk about next.